Hello, everyone. Welcome to the September 28th, 2022 meeting of SIG-Auth. Let's kick it off. We have a lot of items on the agenda, as you can see. Can y'all see the screen okay? All right, with that, let's get started with sub-resources.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, go for it.
Do you want to present the document? Actually, it looks like you already have it open in a tab.
Or I could give you share.
It doesn't matter. Let's see. We had a long discussion on this at API Machinery last week.
Feel free to share your screen if you want.
Yes, I think I can. Let's see. All right. Hopefully you're seeing only one window. I will change that a little bit. Okay, so I'll just go as fast as I can, and if this is too slow, then stop me. Why did I start this proposal? Basically, API Machinery has a couple KEPs that are blocked on this need for sub-resources or something else that accomplishes the purposes of sub-resources. It's a very sad story. We've been keeping this poor author waiting for like 2 years through a comedy of errors. So I'm motivated to at least have a direction so that we can give an answer even if we're not ready to implement something this instant. Yeah, so basically the problem is sometimes people need to make generic controllers which operate on some portion of a resource, like finalizers or labels or annotations or like something that many resources have. But we don't want the controller to have update on all resources in the whole cluster because that is pretty broad security. So the goal is to limit this somehow to specific fields. So I've declared it a non-goal for these purposes. Also reading, limiting what fields can be read. Because I think that makes it a lot harder. If that is too much of a non-goal, we can talk about expanding the scope of this, but I'd like to keep it as targeted as possible. Yeah, so today, I'll just go through the designs real quick. Today, the only solution that we have really is to use sub-resources to make a sub-resource. And this is what we've asked. This is what David is asking this KEP author to do, is make a sub-resources for this proposed liens field, and also one for the finalizers field because they should really be similar. But in reading that KEP for proposing adding a sub-resource for finalizers, I realized that this makes life very inconvenient for clients because every sub-resource implies a whole new set of functions in the client, like not just an additional thing, but a whole new set of functions. Like you can't set the scale sub-resource without calling the special like scale functions, and you can't update the status resource without calling the like apply status, etc. So if we make 3 or 4 or 5 new sub-resources, that implies like a bunch of functions, like that's several verbs and times all the client objects, all the clients that we generate. It's a lot of functions, and it's going to be confusing to users which ones they need to call. Additionally, when you're writing your controller, you have to write it in such a way that it uses a sub-resource, right? Like an existing client would be able to set labels through the labels, like through the regular object, just updating spec or whatever. But if you want your controller to be able to be controlled in this way, this permissions model, you have to make it use this separate sub-resource. You also have to like if you want to update multiple fields, this controller has to make multiple calls. You can't combine that, right? So I think this is actually super inconvenient, and I hope that we can do better. Any questions so far?
I had one question that occurred to me. after
I
the
see your mouth
last.
moving, but I don't hear any words, Jordan.
Really?
I hear words.
I hear you, Jordan.
Yeah.
That's
Daniel,
why
can you hear any
knock
of us?
over Daniel.
Is there a problem with my audio?
Did you hear them say that they could hear me?
What happened? You've all been hearing me this whole time, right? I don't know what happened. I could hear you
Yeah,
at the
we
beginning of
all
the
hear
meeting.
you.
Um,
You've just been the only one talking so far, so it was all okay. Daniel leaves like, I thought we had a very productive discussion.
right. Well, hold on. Yeah, I can't hear a word you're saying. So if I've been steamrolling anybody, I'm sorry. Give me 1 second to grab a different pair of headphones.
Okay.
No, Tim. No, it is not.
Let's see. Can I hear people now?
Can you hear me now?
Check.
Hello, hello, hello.
Oh, that's
Not
awesome.
at all. Wow.
If you're joining, well, you can't hear me. Yeah, that was what I was going to recommend, Tim.
So I think this is like a demonstration of cert rotation gone wrong, and you can no longer rebuild your secure connection to.
Yeah. Okay. I figured it out. My Mac muted itself. I don't know how that happened.
All right,
Sorry about
can
that.
you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
All right. You were the only one talking for most of the time, so you weren't steamrolling anyone. It was fine.
Okay.
I
I only want to do that if it's on purpose.
Okay. So you talked about the case where we have a controller we want to let write finalizers or liens or conditions or some specific field, and we don't want to grant broad write access for a couple of fields, and we don't want to make them jump through hoops to call n different sub-resources. So that makes sense to me. The other direction is sort of what I was also trying to understand, which is we have a field like liens actually, where users have broad update rights today, and we don't want update to automatically give them the right to do lien stuff. Like liens are have implications for the system, and so we want to, in addition to update, you need to specifically have update on liens.
Okay, that's a complicated question. Can I defer it a little bit?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
There are a couple other hands too.
Yeah, let's go through the other hands.
Which Tim is going first? I think it was Tim Hawkins.
I think all clear won.
Oh.
Sure. So I left this comment lower down on the doc, but this feels like something that in the past we've always just dealt with by admission control. I know that's kind of addressed here as a possibility as we just add another admission controller for this. But I guess my question is why? I don't know exactly what my question is. It just feels like something that in the past, we've just said this is an admission control problem.
So I think okay, I have two answers for this. One is this is an admission control problem. Is here's a lot of instructions. Please go write an admission controller. That is not a low bar to entry at all. Not everybody is capable of doing that easily or within a small time constraint. And this is a common desire, right? This is solvable with admission control is something you could maybe tell a cloud provider. It's not something that you can tell a system administrator. My second answer is that I don't know if anyone else makes this distinction, but I make the distinction between policy and authorization. And I like permissions and policy are separate things. And I think ability to change a specific field is pretty tightly scoped, and it's reasonable to have that covered in the permissions model, not necessarily the like the policy layer. I don't know if anyone else thinks of those things as different layers, but I do.
I was gonna maybe add to that, and I think David and I were sort of on the same page here. As I think we were looking at this as something that is the same on all environments, and it can't be turned off because it's like an ambient thing. Of how
Yes, that affected the recommended choice here, and I think, yeah. Do we want to debate that now, or do we want to see what Tim Hawken has to say?
I think we can go to other Tim.
Yeah, Tim
Hey,
H.
So I just wanted to say, like, while this is not at all my home SIG, I took interest in this CAP because I do a lot of the API reviews. And so I'm looking at this from the API review perspective where, we're trying really hard to give people good advice on how to do things safely and securely. In the bad old days, that was do whatever you want. And now we're trying to be more like secure by default and minimum access and least privilege by default. So that's where my interest in this comes in. Personally, I don't have a problem with the idea of multiple sub resources. Like, it's a hoop. I don't think it's a terrible hoop. It's not great, but it's not terrible. I do think that as our life cycle management and referential integrity options get more sophisticated, more people will want to use them. And that will mean, in today's model, granting a lot of spec access to a lot of actors who don't really need spec access. They just need the ability to hook life cycle events. And so that's why I think this is going to just grow in importance in how we solve this. I read the doc and my comments are there. The idea of being able to do filtered reads is compelling to me. But like I said, I'm not against the idea of just having multiple sub resources if that's the thing that turned out to be most implementable.
Okay.
Mike, can we go?
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, so I guess to Tim Allclair's point, I guess he wasn't recommending multiple sub resources. I think he was recommending writing an admission control for like lean specifically, and I think that makes sense for anything in core. That's what we do for signer name. That's what we do for we did for PSP. That's how we generally.
You're saying
initiate.
the suggestion is for us to write an admission controller, which solves this problem for people.
Yeah, since leans is
okay.
going to be
yeah,
a
so
core
that's actually design number 2. Yeah, so that is an option. It's the next option
yeah,
in the
I
document.
totally agree that this is challenging for people working outside of core, or challenging or impossible for them to follow this pattern, but it is the pattern that we followed for core features in the past.
Yeah. Okay, why don't I continue, and since I think this is relevant, I'll go on to the next design. I was going to skip it, but the design 2 option is basically like, how could I solve this without changing anything in tree? And it's listed a design how you could solve it, like some objects that are analogous to CRDs, like there's a field selection expression and like something that binds them to users or groups, etc. So the reason why, more or less the reason why this design, okay, there's a few reasons. Reliability is bad with webhooks, and this misses David's constraint of it's on everywhere, because this can be turned off. And David and Mo mentioned this also. The constraint that it is on everywhere lets people plan for it, and like developers, like if it's on everywhere, it's like, oh yeah, this is something I do in my development cluster. It's not something I miss until deployment time when I find I need this strange other permission I didn't know about. So I think that's the justification for the it has to be on everywhere pattern that I understand. I don't know if I failed to capture something, David or Mo, please jump in.
Yeah, that's a good expression. I would like to see the check that is made be something that is in conformance over time. This is the way our API behaves. And the actual permissions themselves could be granted, someone could say, oh, I don't care about this. I'm going to grant everyone permission.
Yeah.
But the checks are always made.
Yeah, so that requirement rules out design 2. It also rules out design 3, which is like just modify RBAC and fix it there. It also rules out the variations where instead of a webhook, you build a admission plugin inside API server. So that gets us down to 2 designs. Design
Sorry,
4 and 5.
Why does it rule out an admission plugin?
Because those can be turned off.
I mean, all admission plugins can be turned off, and you won't have a cluster that passes conformance.
So you can, well, you have to do something that passes conformance, but you can turn off admission plugins and just use the right. You can turn off various parts of the chain. If you turn off everything, you probably won't pass conformance. If you turn off parts of it, you probably can.
So why can't this be the part that if you turn off doesn't pass, the cluster no longer passes conformance?
So like people configure their permissions in different ways, right? Like you can use RBAC, but you don't have to use RBAC. You can let the permissions checks gets passed on to a plugin that is a webhook and calls out to some other authorization system, right?
Yeah, so
or you can use them,
two
or you can use them both
examples
together.
The 2 examples that we referenced, like the CSR signer thing and the garbage collector enforcement, both of those are in-tree admission plugins, which do authorization checks. So like the fact that an authorization check is done, that's codified in the admission plugin. It is calling out to the authorization subsystem. So you can satisfy that authorization check with RBAC or whatever auth Z you have hooked up.
Yeah.
So I think that's what Mike's talking about.
Yeah, I would say the design 5 and 4 are effectively going to be not a new thing in the authorizer chain, but new call sites and API server that call the existing authorizer chain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's what the CSR admission controller is doing. It looks at a signer name field and an object and calls just authorization.
Yeah. So you can disable the authorization chain or do whatever you want, but you can't. We're not letting you opt out of the fact that API server is going to do those checks, even if the checks all return true or just go into a black hole because they're not configured to do anything.
I see some distinction between saying a particular API has enforcement on it, and this is how all APIs are controlled. Right, so a CSR plugin, touches one thing, but if we're looking at this is how you handle sub-object update permission, having that be optional looks like a way to create an inconsistent API model.
I don't actually feel that strongly about whether it's in an admission plugin that's on by default and can be turned off if people want to shoot themselves in the foot, or if it's like hard coded into storage. The one problem that like just implementing a new admission plugin would have is that it doesn't satisfy the case where we want a controller to be limited to only updating a few fields, and we don't want to give it broad update permission otherwise, because in order for it to even reach that admission plugin, you would have to give that controller like total update permission. And then
yeah, I haven't gotten to that problem yet.
It's like lock it down. So
yeah, I haven't gotten to that problem, but yes, this design doesn't have the property where you get an overly broad permission, which is then scoped down. Yeah. Okay. Shall I outline the like what is recommended, which is design 4 here. So basically, we're going to do a couple like the straw proposal. Like obviously this needs to be written up more, but the like straw proposal is to add a like virtual permission verb. I understand we do that, and like you can grant the permission via RBAC or via like some external system. However the system administrator is in the habit of granting permissions, you can grant this permission that way. So it'll be it's not an edit permission, but it is an indication, like if you have this permission, it's an indication that we're going to do the secondary auth checks later in the chain once we know what is changing. So you check like the flow looks like, okay, does this person have edit or update permission? No. Does it have the per field edit permission? Yes. Okay. At that point, we proceed down the request chain, like we put something in the context or something to tell us that we need to do these secondary checks. When we're going to write to storage, at the point where we have both the old and the new object, it is at that point pretty easy to diff the two and figure out what fields are changing. And we can use some of the code written for server-side apply to express this, so we don't have to write a bunch of structured set manipulation, right? We can just reuse some of that code. So I wouldn't look too like this is modifiable, like how exactly we want to express which field somebody is able to have. Right here I have like you construct a verb based on the type name and the field that they want to modify, and do a regular permissions check based on that constructed name. And you do this for every modified field. There's like we could do more complicated things where there's intermediate objects and it like gives you a set of fields, and I don't think that's important to settle right now. Okay, we could even have a negative permission if so desired. David thinks it's a bad idea, but if so desired, we could have a like you can only modify this. You can only modify spec if you don't have the no spec permission. Of course, that depends on other things in the authorizer chain not letting you do it anyway. But you only get into this condition if that's the case anyway, right? Okay. Yeah, maybe I should stop there. The properties are like, obviously it works with your existing permissions granting system, whatever that might be. It works on existing resource types, like all resource types. You don't have to do something special for CRDs. And this code is basically all API server code, so we don't have to change admission plugins or anything like that. Yeah, okay. Tim and Mo. I think Tim won.
Does this lock you into an expression that is versioned? Like, hypothetically, I can have a v1 API that says foo_bar_bat, and I can have in field, foo.bar.bat, and I can have a v2 API that says coax.bar.foo, and they can mean the same thing and be convertible. Like, does this expression that you're describing here lock me into one of those versions?
As written, yes. Is that absolutely necessary? I don't know. In practice, I think most of the fields that we're going to do this for are in metadata, and that stuff has never changed. And we'd already have a giant mess if it did change. So
I guess my point is, one of the carrots that you dangled was we could provide filtered gets, but I can't actually express that if I want to be version safe across time.
Yeah, I would say that the design for filtered get, like the sketch design for filtered gets in this, was invalidated by one of David's requirements. So at the moment, I'm not dangling filtered gets. If that is something that you need, then we probably need to think of a different design.
No, I mean, personally, I don't have a strong need for it, but it's certainly come up before as wouldn't it be neat if. But for me, it was the extra carrot that got me along.
We had many versions of this problem in server-side apply, and we did come up with some extremely clever, maybe probably way too clever places where we convert between versions very carefully. You can only do this if you have data in the object, because not all of our conversion functions survive objects that have fields missing. So there's code that finds an order of switching between all versions because we don't want people owning things in different versions. So we have to like figure out what collides with what. Like it works. I don't know if anybody completely understands it anymore, but so it's possible, but difficult to convert between versions. I would prefer not to do it personally. Mo?
So I think this is related to a thing Jordan had said earlier, but it's sort of a specific sort of nuance of it, which is, I'll speak by example. With pod security admission, we were really careful to say that the policies were versioned. So that way, if you needed the latest meaning, you could ask for it. But if you built your stuff around a particular version of the pod spec, that's where you could sort of point things at. The thing that I don't know if any of these sort of talk about is today, if you grant update, it sort of means update on the whole object till sort of like the end of time, and doesn't matter
Yes.
really what changes in the object. Like, if you add new fields. So
Yeah, to use this problem to use this mechanism to solve the problem Jordan asked about, you would have to not grant users update and then grant them this per field thing and grant them the special verbs that means the field they want to change. Now as written, it is a recursive check. So it starts at the root of the object and goes down. So if you have permission to modify spec, and we check that first, it's only a couple extra checks.
So I think you still need some way to express that this field is special, and you need a special check no matter what for this field. I think it's compatible with somewhere in this design. I'm just saying that if I add some new lean field or whatever, some new privileged field, right?
I think the difficulty in doing that is that over time that adds up to a ton of extra auth-z checks.
So if I wanted,
if everybody does that for their field, if everyone does that for their field, and we add over time we've added 20 fields, and you do a create and it's 20 auth-z requests to see if you can do the create or not. I'm proposing we're adding a few requests, but I'm also proposing a mechanism where we only go down this path in certain conditions.
I guess I'm thinking of it shouldn't be too hard to express hey, you can create a pod but not a privileged one, right? Yes, I know we have PSA and stuff, but I'm thinking about that really obvious use case.
Yeah, I mean so I think that's a policy question and not a per field authorization question. You have permissions to set the admin pod flag or whatever it is. You can just only set it to false. I wouldn't use this mechanism to enforce that you can always get the default value, because you can't say anything about the field at all. Okay, I guess that could work, but why wouldn't you do that in a policy context instead of a field level permission context? The attribute I'm trying to capture here is can you modify the field at all? Which doesn't say anything about the default value, I guess. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm just wrong and it would be better to solve it this way, but I think we need the policy stuff, the policy layer anyway. So I don't feel too compelled to need to solve it with this mechanism.
I think the difficulty of the can you modify this field at all is when we are talking about adding a field to objects that gives them sort of power on other objects or on the system that they didn't previously have. So the lanes field is a good example, right? Previously, if I could set pods, maybe pods are a bad example because if you make a privilege, you can take the picture, but if I can create config maps, like previously that was just a blob of data, and like, you know, I can create these things and they sit there inert. And now we're adding a field that lets them like block deletion of other objects or block namespaces or whatever it is. And so like being able to saying we need a policy layer, someone has to decide that they want to disallow that for users who otherwise could just create and update these things. That kind of goes back to the, if it's not there by default, people aren't going to realize they need it. And then someone's going to do something clever or disruptive. And then people, you know, cluster admins are going to come to us and say like, why didn't you protect me from this? Like, oh, well, you could have put a policy in place, but you didn't know you needed to. I think some fields are special and disruptive. And I'm trying to figure out how do we safely add those fields to objects we've previously let users just create and update because they were inert safe objects.
Yeah,
I mean,
that was
there
not the
could
main question
be,
I raised my hand for, and I will ask my other question real quick. I'm curious if what you're talking about, Daniel, is envisioning only update modification or also create. If this could be run on create, and it would be like you set this from nil to this value, and so we're going to check. I was trying to understand.
I think to be complete, it would have to run on create also.
Okay. Yeah, I was trying to figure out what that would look like if every field in the object was new and modified on create.
The check that is sketched out in the straw proposal is recursive, so it starts at like spec. If that comes back a yes, it doesn't check on anything under spec. And if like metadata is yes, then it doesn't check anything under metadata. So it is a minimal, like if you're allowed to edit large parts of the object, then it is a minimal number of checks. Yeah, I think so. If it is desirable that, well, okay, I think actually I've heard two incompatible requests here. Like the desire for us not to like have a large permission like edit granted and then later scoped down because you don't have fine-grained permissions. Like that was something Jordan expressed, and that's also something that seems reasonable and desirable to me. But then I think that also is incompatible with this notion that like we're going to introduce new fields and you have to have a special thing to get this new field set. Like I don't think if we were starting from scratch today, would we do it that way? Would we split the permission space by verb and field? Like you have create on spec. Okay, great. You have create not on spec, but on spec.replicas. What does that even mean? I'm not sure. Or you have update on like spec.replicas, but create on all of spec. Like that comes out to be like, you get very fine-grained control, but would you want to be the system administrator who has to figure out who should get which of our thousands of potential special permissions? Like that does not sound too easy to me. I realize I'm also adding like the permissions in this model are all constructed, and so we're adding basically a combinatorially large number of them. But at least it would only be for users who have the special like, please go check this tree of combinatorially large permissions. Yeah, I don't know.
Jordan, is your desire to add the field leans, but prevent normal updaters from having the ability to set that value? I know that my goal, at least the first one that I thought of, maybe I have that goal as well, but my goal was to be able to produce controllers or other clients that have the ability to modify leans, but not the ability to modify the spec of an object.
I am more focused on the first one you mentioned, where, and maybe this is being burned from finalizers, like where any user with update can add or remove any finalizer they want. And so finalizers are actually unsuitable for like actually ensuring we protect things. You know, if we have an external system and we need to clean up a reference in an external system, we can put a finalizer on there with a controller, but any user with update can take the finalizer off if they read something on the internet. It's like, here's how to unstick deletion of your objects. And so I'm scared of users Stack Overflow, like finalizers, or like in the system. So fields that like have implications across objects or across the system, I want to be able to say, yeah, you can do that, or you can't do that. Yeah, Tim.
So my concern is with David. I see more and more controllers coming up and people granting them overly broad access, which just scares the pants off me. I hear your point, Jordan. I've certainly seen those Stack Overflow posts, but at least the blast is localized, right? Like, well, you blew something up in your own namespace. I don't feel too bad for you, right? Like, we can do better about that, but taken to its conclusion, you have sort of an arbitrary list of actors who can potentially have permissions on individual members of those lists. Like, I don't know, in the expanded CAP, which tried to add sub resources for labels and annotations and finalizers in addition to liens. One of the things I thought was interesting was, and I know that it's not the normal Kubernetes sort of REST semantic, but was we could make it possible through sub resources to say, this person is allowed to add annotations, but only annotations that have this prefix, right? And actually, that's kind of interesting. I can give my foobar controller access to all annotations that start with foobar.com/. And that gives you some limited impact, finalizers too, some limited attack of what you're describing as a problem. Me, that was attractive.
One feature of this design is written is that it lets you do that for fields where the key is separate. So like it would work for conditions, but not for annotations, because annotations I can't do prefix matching in a string basically, because I can't construct a permission that way, a virtual permission. But I can construct a permission out of a field path that includes a identifier of some item on the list.
And since sub-resources pretend to be URL paths, things that have path-like prefixes sort of shake out for free if we want to extend that way.
So I think I'm not solving and I'm not sure even my backup solutions would solve these additions. So there's like two problems of, one is giving people permissions who you want to give the permission to. The other is taking the permission away from people who have it through implication of our current system, but that's undesirable to us. Do we need to solve that problem in order to make progress on the first problem? Is my question, I guess. And sorry, Mo, please go ahead.
Jordan, would your request be satisfied if we just defined a global mechanism to say that certain generic fields are special and require special checks, and it just happens? Like, so, like, you could just say, hey, metadata.liens is special. And we could expand that list as new special things came up if we had to, but it would just be a more tightly targeted thing that just says, when we add something that could be disruptive, this is a candidate for an extra permission check. So it's not just update or create. It's like create, update, plus special permission check for messing with this field.
It's kind of awkward because some of the fields that you want to do this, like it's legitimate to want to set liens when you create, or set finalizers when you create an object. Like, in fact, it's almost necessary if you want to be certain that things happen in a given order. So that I don't know, maybe you could have one for update and a different one for create.
I mean, if we saw these two as two different sides of the same coin, like sometimes you only want to grant access to this one thing. Sometimes you, in specific fields, you want a generic updater or creator to also specifically have access to this field. I would map those to the same permission check, so that the controller who you're going to give targeted access to that field, like you have to you have to give access specifically to that field. And then a user who has generic update access would say, this is a special field and it's disruptive to the system. So if you want them to set liens, you also need to give them lien permissions. So you could set it while you're creating if you have permission to set liens.
So it's awkward. Okay, so for new fields, I can see maybe we could get away with this, but for existing fields like finalizers, it seems pretty disruptive to take away permissions that people already have.
Oh yeah, no. There's no question. We can't break existing users, which is why I'm so frustrated with the current state of finalizers.
I see.
Yeah, I don't think we're trying to change default behavior for any API, mostly just because I don't think any of us wants the support case.
But then that's even more confusing. Like, imagine somebody who comes into the system like 3 years from now and sees like a number of fields that you don't get included with the basic update permission, and like another number of other fields that you do get included with the basic update permission, but those fields are like equally sensitive.
So we could have a timestamp comment that starts with "I'm sorry," and then it explains the situation.
Past mistakes are not an excuse to repeat past mistakes.
Right, like we already get reproachful looks from people who are like, wait, I can like change owner references, like make stuff get deleted, like what in the world? And we say, I'm sorry, yes, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
So thinking about this, if we were to scope Daniel's KEP down to, or Daniel's proposal down to just metadata fields, so it would be fields that apply to every object we have. And would we be willing then to say, as we introduce new fields, there is a default allow, or oh gosh, that sounds terrible, but a default allow or a default deny in order to get the behavior of liens as an example?
I think the if I were to do this, like, it just bothers me so much that you have to like do things differently for different fields. Like, I think it would be better to like leave the existing permissions as they are, deprecate them, tell everybody to use the new update to verb and the create to verb, and do permissions check on those. And those don't include the objects that you should, or the fields that you shouldn't get by default.
All right,
and
Daniel,
then like
slightly better. What if we always checked, but the default policy we provide always allows updates to finalizers, as a for example, and if you wish to change that, you could take ownership of it and delete whatever rule allowed it, similar to what we do with default RBAC today, where you can take ownership and either remove permissions.
Yeah, that's kind of the wrong thing by default, right?
We're gonna have to make reconciliation a whole lot less painful to mess with if that's what we want.
I don't want to take the whole meeting for this. I know there were other people who had items. I think the solve narrow permissions for controllers is a useful piece that's a lot more straightforward. I'm not sure what to tell people who are wanting to add liens, and I think users will do bad things with them, like human users will do bad things. I'm not sure what to tell them, but I agree those are distinct problems that could probably be tackled separately. I don't know.
Okay.
Tim?
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
I was just gonna make the last point on the evolution of stuff. I mean, what we've done in a few other places is decide, wow, that was a bad thing to have done. Let's make it possible for users to do the right thing in the future and recommend to them they should, but that becomes an opt-in thing on a cluster level granule with a well-documented escape hatch. I'm thinking about stuff like the endpoints manipulation, right? Like, we over-granted that permission by default, and now we say we don't, but you can turn it back on if you want to. And then implementers like OpenShift and GKE and EKS can choose whether they want to go through the pain of moving their customers over to the new model or not. And I mean, the truth is we have to support both forever. That's sort of the commitment we made, right? So any evolution has to involve some way for people to opt in and to opt out. black.
Okay, I guess I will write up something slightly more detailed than this document and circulate it for another round before we make a cap.
Yeah, thank you for
And,
bringing this up. Super interesting.
Yeah, okay, I'll let y'all go back to your other topic.
All right, next we have status update, client exec proxy. Nick, are you ready?
Yeah, this was basically just I needed reviews on this. I did get additional reviews from it looks like Mo looked at it. So I guess I would it's kind of the same as the next item, which is what remains to get the CAP merged and approved for alpha in 126. Mo, you looked at it recently. Is there anything that you want to call out?
So let's see. Rita, do you mind sharing your screen and putting up the CAP real fast? I think top of mind for me was that the CAP says that this would be feature gated, which it would be. I just don't know how that will work with kubectl. Because it is something that is exposed or would be exposed. Like the crappy answer to that question could be that you literally cannot use this through kubectl until it GAs or something. You have to use it in other places or somehow, but that sounds garbage.
Let's just not feature gate it.
I mean, what we've done with other stuff in client, like any flags get like alpha or experimental in the flag. Any dedicated commands get put under the alpha subcommand, and any dedicated configurations, like the API version on the config, is alpha. So like however you're interacting with the surface area of it, you're typing experimental or alpha, or like your config is alpha. And then it's really clear.
So this is a modification of a V1 GA API with a new field.
Oh.
So should we reintroduce the V1 alpha one?
V2 alpha 1.
What?
V2 alpha 1? I don't know about that, because I don't think there's any changes that we want to make to V1. I think we just want to eventually get this into V1.
Right, so V2 alpha 1 implies that we're going to end at V2, which is not the end goal. The end goal is V1 with this new field that's perfect. So I don't know what sort of like the project level guidance on something like this is, and but I think there probably should be something that I think you should not be able to accidentally run into this feature. If you need to somehow.
We just did this for the subject whatever review, subject attributes review. I thought we were going to reintroduce the alpha.
That's
a
new resource type. So
well, this is
an
a
existing
config group that is an API group, right?
This is the existing exec API request response. There's a new field. And yeah, when it's in the API server, feature gates are fine. Like that's a well-paved path. But in clients, we don't have feature gates in clients. If that is the only sticking point on the design, I'm actually okay with finding an appropriately visible way, like in the implementation review, to say, like, we can name the field alpha until it graduates, or we can require you to set an environment variable, or like something where you explicitly have to opt in to experimental alpha stuff. I don't know that that mechanism has to be pinned down in the CAP.
Okay, that's fine. Rita, do you mind going to my latest review comments just so I don't forget I think I had like maybe one other thing I wanted to ask folks.
Jordan, is you're concerned that it won't round trip since it is a field, or like?
Well, no, my concern is mostly I just want to make sure that until this is, I guess GA, I think his beta is still supposed to be off by default now, I think. that a user has to take some action for them to be opted into this behavior. That's all. That's the main thing. It's not that I think this
Right.
is
So
going to go wrong.
I'm asking what the problem is with reintroducing a V1 alpha 1 with additional fields. Is it the round trip tests?
A V1 alpha 1.
Copy this API group that is V1 into V1 alpha 1, add a couple fields.
I thought this was a pre-existing type which had previously existed in V1 alpha 1. I don't want to reintroduce it with a different schema. That's
Same schema
It's not persisted.
with additional fields.
So technically,
I do want to let the other to their if I guess the question is, was this only sticking point for this? And if so, I'm happy to work through like
All right.
how we make it clear that this is in implementation.
Sounds good. Maybe too heavyweight then.
yeah, I think this is fine for like offline, but I think metrics for this are interesting because this code is invocable through webhooks on the API server. So yes, it is the KEP is scoped as, hey, I have a client that wants to authenticate to the API server, but that same code is used by the API server to authenticate to external identities. So it can be turned around and done in the other direction. Presumably, if that is happening, you want to know at least something about this is happening. Like, I don't know, proxy latency or something.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Uh,
You also had a comment about, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nick. I don't know if I had.
I was just gonna say, you also had a comment about speedy. So I assume that's somewhat important to resolve.
Yeah, I think we would just need to have tests that prove that when you're using this stuff like kubectl exec still works, which goes to the speedy upgrade stuff, and at the end it should still work. Like you should get auth correctly, and the whole upgrade request thing should happen as well.
Right.
I just remember when I did the really hacky POC of this, I had to really work at it to make the stuff work for speedy. Like I ended up doing something really strange to kind of make it work. But yeah,
Makes sense.
Did we end up deciding
who is on the hook for like approving the PR?
So I had done reviews on
Mo
the
might
previous
have been
versions, and I got it to a point where I was pretty happy with it. And I think Mo had some outstanding comments, which Mo and Nick were working through. I can take one more pass. Mo can take one more pass, and then we will both approve it. Sound good?
Yep.
Kind of the same question. Who needs to stamp this so we can start doing it? I've gone through and done so I think there was some stuff around. It's not clear why there was MQLS Federation stuff in there. I came up with a different way to do my model of that, just using annotation. So I've just cut all that stuff out. The API object is very simple now. The kubelet projected volume is very simple. So
Yeah. David, do you mind taking another look at this? I think
I will. It'll be Friday, but I will.
Sure. And I will do the same.
I know one random question. Mo, you had a lot of questions around metrics and stuff. Is that, I agree, we need metrics. everything I can find says like you don't need a super nailed down plan for an alpha feature. So I kind of put some thoughts in on like what we need, but
Yeah, I don't think you need it immediately. I was more like my initial thoughts on the exec proxy stuff. I'd been like, oh, it probably doesn't need many, but then I was like, oh, but you can use it in ways that are not obvious, so maybe you do. And so I think we want metrics for all of our stuff. It's just
yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I know we're super short on time here and don't have much time to cover reference grant, but I wanted to just spend, I guess, the few minutes we have left trying to answer a couple key questions here. One, reference grant is used widely within Gateway API, and SIG storage is showing interest in one of their KEPs. Is there interest in a neutral home for it? And then two, if so, should we delay our plans to graduate reference grant to beta within our Gateway API and networking API group? I can give more context. I know we're very short on time here.
So one thing I'm not clear on is the reference grant is a way to say, as a way for one person in namespace A to say, I own the things in this namespace and I'm okay with objects of this type in namespace B referencing me, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Correct.
But in order to make that check generic, how does some generic, let's assume admission plugin, know that there should be a referential match? Like, do you have to specifically, like, do you write an object or do you write an admission plugin for every potentially consuming object?
Yeah, it's hard to make this a generic, and Jordan covered this in one of his questions in the agenda as well. It's hard to make this truly generic because the reference could come from any number of things. Right now in Gateway API, it's well defined because it's one of two places, and those places are very clearly defined. In the SIG storage proposal, it's one very clear place as well. And in all cases, the proposal is for it to be implemented by the implementing controller of the API. Not a generic implementation. Open to other approaches here, but that's what we are doing right now.
Yeah, so it's not an admission time check, it's a runtime check. So the controller that's following the reference is assumed to already have read permission, and it's self-gating on the presence of one of these reference grants in order to say, like, before I follow this link you sent me, I'm going to see if the person on the other end is happy with that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that was how I always understood it. I mean, I'd love to see a generic solution to this, but I always understood it as here's a consistent-ish way that you can apply incrementally to more and more places over time. Opt in.
Yeah, so a lot of the questions I had were sort of around, like, how do those various controllers we're expecting to gate themselves on this, like, can they do it consistently or in a way that doesn't leak information? Is the reference fine-grained enough? And so Rob and I were kind of going back and forth. And I think something like an admission check or a storage check on the reference grant object itself, to say, like, if you want to allow exposing secrets from your namespace to other namespaces, you at least need, like, read permission on secrets in this namespace. Like, I think that could be part of this API's, like, recommended deployment. Yeah, it was kind of, I know you tossed it in last night, Rob, so I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to go back and forth. I would recommend people read this if they don't remember the discussion from last year. And maybe we could, like, kind of take some of these questions async either in the doc or in the mailing list, and hopefully get some direction, clarity like before the next meeting.
Do we have other existence proofs of places where we do sort of controller on behalf of user work and we verify that the user was allowed to do the thing that the controller would do for them, like creating pods from a deployment, right? In theory, I could create a deployment and not have the any pod permissions and still get pods. Or I could change my labels on my pod and trick a deployment into adopting me and then deleting it. Like, have we done, clearly we should be doing these sorts of checks, but it involves keeping some state about who did the deployment in the first place. And like, there's a whole lot of semantic questions that I have. Do we do it anywhere? That's my question.
The only place I'm aware of is in certificate API, because the API captures the person that created the certificate signing request. And then the controllers do like approve checks based on the identity of the user. But that's the only place I know that we capture that. And even that, like other places are like, can we record the creating user or the updating user like in an authoritative, trustworthy way? And it actually is kind of problematic.
It sort of goes back to the sub-resources conversation.
Yeah, plus
could we have a field that users can't set themselves, but we set on their behalf?
Plus, do we persist like personally identifiable information like everywhere? Like, no, probably not.
That ship already sailed. Managed fields.
That is set from user agent, not from identity. And it doesn't explode groups, and I don't think it explodes username. It might make special cases for service accounts. I can't remember the derivation. Tim, to your question, like, yeah, we've sort of hand waved over like, yeah, but that's sort of what deployments mean. If you give someone deployment right permission, you are giving them pod right permission. And the fact that it's contained within the same namespace, it makes it very local and very visible. As soon as you start like crossing namespaces and saying like, oh, you have this write permission on this object here, therefore you have read permission on that object in that namespace, that's where it starts to get really wonky and hard to reason about.
I mean, I remember the CVE on ingress across ingress across namespaces, right? So I'm keen on just how complicated this is. I just don't want to set the bar for things that is higher than the bar we've set in the past without any path towards reaching the bar.
Yeah, I know we're out of time. I would encourage people to look at this, ask questions, especially with an eye to like, if this was a generic thing that multiple projects were going to use, like what assumptions made sense in the context of Gateway that maybe we should expand or rethink or refine if it's going to be generic. So, and Rob, would you prefer we do this like in this doc or on the list, or do you care?
No preference. I can create another doc if that's preferable too. Just happy to work with this. And I think SIG-Auth is also relevant here. So I may bring this up at SIG-Auth next week.
Okay. Let's keep going in this doc. If you want to hoist it out, if it gets unwieldy, that's fine.
Sounds great.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody.